Welcome everybody. Hopefully a few more people will trickle in as their snacks get eaten. It's always kind of an interesting time where I'm between you and dinner. So hopefully the next 40 minutes I don't make you more nauseous than you already are. But my name is Paul Holland. I'm the director of the Open Program Office in Hewlett Packard Enterprise. We used to be an open source program office, or an OSPO, and we'll talk a little bit about what the change was that drove us there. But OSPOs and OPOs both represent different organizational structures in the face of technology changes. And so adapting to those changes is very imperative and critical for our existence. So we'll kind of explore our thought process, and I'd love to get your perspective, whether you have comments or questions. What we're going to talk about today is the following. We'll reflect a little bit on open source software and the dynamics there as a precursor to then look at AI and what that AI introduces. We'll talk about optimizing the open source program office or the open program office in the face of those differences and commonalities. We'll talk a little bit about the best organization location in our experience and driving alignment for what you do. But AI, regardless, is rapidly changing what an organization does. Open technologies are becoming more pervasive. The rapid change of pace is increasing. And so what we'll reflect on kind of what we learned from open source and use it as we apply it in the world of AI. So what you're not going to hear in the next 40 minutes is a talk about how we use AI, although we do that. That would be a wonderful talk, and maybe for the next one. But we'll talk about how the OSPO or the OPO can take advantage of the trends in order to look at its charter maybe a little bit differently or more expansive. So as I look back on open source, what it is, it's more than just technology, right? So technology is absolutely critical. People scratch their own itch, they work in a community, but as that community ecosystem evolve, licenses and compatibility and compliance become important. Services and support of that software become a business model. In fact, Red Hat has made a lot of money in that business itself. It disrupts strategically and tactically. And all of these things ultimately are what we have to pay attention to in the OSPO. Open source is not usually the business strategy, but it is very complementary to that targeted business strategy. So as the OSPO, we translate between what's happening in the business, what's happening in the industry, and ultimately what's happening in the company in order to deliver open source investment, incentives, activities that deliver on that business strategy. So what we've seen over the last few years is open source program office has evolved to kind of meet that need. They provide strategic leadership in the open source realm. They provide community outreach, activities like this. They provide capacity building. Obviously, they are involved in the compliance and legal aspects. They interface with that. And they also are now increasingly involved in security-related activities. Whether or not we own that directly, there often is a CISO that's responsible for it, but open source is a big part of what they're looking at, and therefore it's a big part of what an OSPO deals with. All of these things have evolved to help engage the business to deliver on that open source strategy. So let's move then to think about what AI does to this system. Right? If you think about the AI system, you have the data, the code, and the models that are trained, that then deliver corresponding weights, that then there's some fine-tuning and inferencing mixed in with the prompts in terms of the actual execution of the model, and out comes some outputs. If you think about it in the kind of an abstract way, what's different with AI than really with open source? Right? You still have algorithms that we're responsible for. We still have software, the code that's running this. Most of it is open source. The models are now maybe new, but maybe not. There are some algorithms with models before. Weights and training data, all of that has similar questions as to what we deal with in OSPO and in open source today. Like, do we open it? Is it proprietary? Is it licensed? What is that license? Is it strategic? Is it tactical? Do we just consume? Do we contribute? What about safety? Where does it come from? All of these kinds of questions on and on. Is it licensed? Is it copyrightable? Is it a derivative work? Is it patentable? Should we patent it? Should we trademark it? Should we use it as a trade secret? Right? So the same kinds of questions that we ask with open source code now get expanded a lot more when we think about AI and all of these pieces that go to play, right? And there's lots of different conversations at this conference about what the guardrails should be, what the rules of engagement should be. And so from my perspective, when I think about open source and more recently about OpenAI, I can't help but think back to open source 20 years ago. Now I was around, many of you may not have been. Some of you may have been around even longer, but you recognize that there's a lot of uncertainty. There's lots of dynamic changes, right? We're talking about agentic AI now. We were talking about LLMs last year. We're talking about other things, potentially with model context protocol and the agent-to-agent exchange. So things are evolving quickly, which 20 years ago we were thinking about, gee, what about an operating system? They had all of these Unixes, and the dynamics of the Linux community drastically changed the world. Very similar today. Like there was license proliferation 20 years ago, right? So if you think about that, it's very interesting to me to kind of reflect on what's happened over the last 20 years. If you think about the freedoms that open source brings, the freedom to run the program as you wish, the freedom to study how the program operates, all of these things have to do with what we're dealing with today in open source. There are very many things that are similar and very many things that are similar but maybe slightly different, right? As I mentioned, AI is built on highly open components. Whether it's open code, whether it's the open weights, whether it's the open data, all of these are open. They could all be proprietary. None of them can be proprietary, and there's a mix and mashing there. Who in your organization is best suited to kind of look at that mashup and figure out how to take advantage strategically, but also then handle the compliance aspect of it? Because all of these things have associated licensing, or should have associated licensing if we can use them as an enterprise. Now, the big difference is that we're now dealing with more than just software, right? Hugging Face replaces GitHub as the de facto place where people are collaborating, where the community is going. Inputs required to generate the AI models, it's still a lot of questions in the courts. I think at last count, there were over 40 cases that I could count of the court trying to figure out some question about this. Again, reminiscent to me of 20 years ago when there were a lot of court cases fighting the SCO lawsuits and the FUD associated with that. So weights may not be copyrightable, licensing out of IP not be appropriate, but again, if you think about it in the context of what you deal with on a daily basis, how similar is it? In my estimation, it's not that drastically different. If I can abstract away all the changes that are happening in community-oriented activities and the abilities to truly play in a community for these other aspects of it. So at HPE, what we did is we evaluated this last year and we said, hey, with so much similarity, who in our org or in your org is in a better position to make sense of these dynamics? Right? Who already deals with strategy, with open activities, with community-oriented things, with people that may not be employees contributing that you're dependent on? Do you go to a different organization? Or in our estimation, it's us, right? We already have the core competency of those kinds of things. AI is another piece of that pie. And so, for instance, who is diving deeper into OpenAI? Let me just take a kind of a detour for a minute and explain kind of the dynamics that we see that's happening in the AI industry. So as I mentioned, AI really is about these four things, right? The software, the models, the weights, and the data. And each one of them we pay attention to because, like I said, some can be proprietary, some can be open. They can mix and mash. We have teams across the company that are doing some interesting things with each of these different combinations. So from the AI software landscape, you don't have to read this. This is a picture that the Linux Foundation AI group puts together around the landscape, and they maintain this. But as you'll see that the vast majority of software in the AI space is open source. Whether it's being created for AI or being leveraged by AI for the training, the vast majority of activity is happening in the open. Now, some of the companies absolutely are proprietary, but they're taking open components and building their companies on open source activities. So the software has very similar dynamics to what you're already dealing with today in an OSPO. From the model perspective, as I mentioned, Hugging Face is now becoming that place, like GitHub, where people collaborate there. There's millions and millions of models on Hugging Face. Things are changing rapidly, much like GitHub again, if you look back. Lots of great collaboration happens when people are exploring, testing, posting, changing, but you'll also notice that there's not a lot of licensing to those models. Also reminiscent to me of GitHub, say about 10 years ago, when open source wasn't really licensed and people stopped using it as much because it didn't have a license, and GitHub started to kind of create a user interface to enable new developers to open source their code with a particular license, and they could pick whatever license was appropriate. Now, much open work is being based on some of these new or foundational models like Llama or BERT. But we still see the proprietary models like the OpenAI with a capital O company, Anthropic and others coming out with some proprietary pieces. But as we'll talk about in a minute, that gap is diminishing. And there was a session earlier today that talked about that as well. So we're all seeing, I think, similar things. In terms of data sources, there's lots of data on Hugging Face. The whole data landscape is changing. Like, should data be licensed? What kind of license do we apply? The Linux Foundation has an open data license. They've also got a kind of a copyleft type of data license. Who are using that? Is it more of a appropriate to use a Creative Commons license? It takes a lot of work to prepare the data. Is that proprietary? Is that a trade secret? Again, some of these similar questions to open source software that must be answered. From the weights perspective, Hugging Face is hosting these, and again, some of them may be open, some of them may not be. Typically, what we're seeing is that when models are posted, they include the weights, and so you'll hear the term open weight model, and not necessarily just an open source model or an open model, indicating that it's about open weights. Because going back to those freedoms, it's about how do we define what open really means. And I know there's open definitions that are happening right now. The OSI has put forth a definition, and that's another great topic for a different day. Models as a service allow vendors to kind of keep weights kind of proprietary, similar to open source, right, with a copy left where you had to share the code, but when you started to host it, you may not have had to share it anymore. And so then the AGPL popped up. And so we're seeing very similar dynamics with the data, the licensing, the weights, and the open source code. So what we're seeing right now, and this is an old picture, this is several months back, was floating around the internet on Twitter, or X now especially, but what we're seeing is the open collaboration is outpacing the closed AI development. So say 4 or 5 years ago when OpenAI came out, it was a defined leader, and it had that leadership position for many, many months, possibly a couple of years. If you think about what's just happened in the last 2 to 3 months with DeepSeek, the model that's been released by the Chinese firm built on non-foundational models are trained and very much competitive. And we've seen even in over the last 2 or 3 weeks how some open models have been released as well that compete on those benchmarks with just as much as those proprietary companies are doing. So how can a company that justify, if they only have a market lead, let's say for weeks, all the billions and billions of dollars investment? They can't. But as open source practitioners, that shouldn't be a surprise, because 20 years ago, we were also facing very similar dynamics, right? You had a couple of incumbent software companies that were ultimately had a monopoly, and open source, in the case of Linux, came forth, and the community rallied and built up a huge ecosystem of software. Similar things are happening in the AI space, and that gap is closing tremendously. Meta is one of the only large players up until now that is kind of open sourced their models. Llama has been used by many, many researchers. And what we're starting to see is even OpenAI, the company a few months ago said they were on the wrong side of history when it came to OpenAI, open source AI. So again, very similar dynamics that I think what's going to happen, and it's starting to prove out, is very similar to the open source dynamics of 20 years ago. You'll see open AI, open with the small o, openness in AI, really win in those fundamental areas like an operating system, like an orchestrator, like a web server, right? We don't even talk about proprietary offerings in those spaces anymore. I think as we see in a couple years, we'll be talking about openness being pervasive throughout those lower levels of the stack. And where there will be money to be made is integrations, particularly for companies, mashups like the web had, and you start to see some of these things from 20 years ago replay themselves. It's kind of like the styles from the 60s. They keep coming back. So as an OSPO, what should you be thinking about? Well, I think OSPOs are in the natural places to extend openness, right? When AI came, people were coming to us to say, how do I deal with this dynamic? I don't know what its license is. How do I get review? Who has expertise? Where can we talk strategically about the options? Where can I go? And that was us. Not that we necessarily had the AI expertise or the depth. We could develop that, but we already had the processes. We already had the corporate brand that people were already coming as an OSPO for that glue that connected the engineering teams with the legal teams, with the technology strategy teams, with the executive business teams, ultimately with the community at large to be able to solve that. So we had that expertise that's existing. We unify that management of all things open. We'll talk in a little bit about, it's not just about open AI. What about open hardware? What about open standards? What about all the other opens that we know have to go into that? So it's just done in a unified way. The Open Program Office then just continues that strategic mission of what the OSPO had before, right? It's just extended. It's a natural extension. There's no new training. There's no new people that you have to go interact with. It's the same us that people interact with. Now we're talking, instead of just open source software, we're talking about open source software in the context of open AI. We're talking about models and weights and data, but again, very similar dynamics to those community-oriented activities. So we have those leverageable strengths. So one might say, well, where is the best place to put an OPO in an organization? Well, there's a few that have been explored. We particularly have been in 3 different organizations. In the BU is good because you have money when things are good. The bad is when things are bad in that BU, you still have responsibility for those other businesses, but they may not get serviced because you're dealing with your own particular management. Could be that with the CTO, it's a natural area to look forward to. It's neutral. It's known for strategic looking forward activities. The down is, how do you then interact with some of those non-technical related things? What about community management? What about marketing activities? What about legal-oriented activities? So there's the thing about the OSPOs that we always had to deal with. Like there's not a great fit in any particular organization because we are ourselves people of many hats that communicate in many different languages across many different functions. For me, that's the exciting part that I love about my job. It's also one of those things that you kind of feel like you're the island of the misfit toys because you're not quite fitting in any of these places, and there's trade-offs. Legal is a great oriented piece. Us particularly, that's where we are currently. We've been in the business, we've been in the CTO office, we're currently in legal with the alignment with the intellectual property, right? Because if you think about the company's strategy, there's a patent portfolio that also has to balance the contributions to the open source community. There's trade secrets that have to then play out there, and that's all closely tied to the CTO office. Again, I think there's trade-offs there, but not all aspects of the things that we deal with are not all legal. So when we start talking about technology and we interface with the CTO a lot, we have to be able to wear those different hats. There's an argument to be made with the CISO, but again, very similarly, CISOs have security-oriented activities, and we do actually speak security language. However, that's not our only language. Ops and IT is also a neutral place that looks across the company, but it's also not typically seen as a place where strategy is made or the organization can ultimately be delivered on its strategic goals. So where is the great place? the best place to do this. Our experience shows that in the end, it doesn't really matter. Because the organization itself, regardless, we have to speak these many different languages. If we're in the CTO office, if we're in legal, if we're in IT, if we're in the CISO, if we're in a BU, it doesn't really matter. What does matter, though, are a few key learnings. That you've got to be cross-functional and collaborative. You've got to be a team. People have to see you as somebody that can contribute to their benefit and that could ultimately deliver on their objectives. A we before I mentality is critical for the company and the community. I was talking with Todd Moore last night about just the nature of the ability to be an ambassador, right? In the sense, sometimes I feel like I'm an ambassador to the United Nations, where I absolutely am from a host country, and that's a critical priority for me, but I also have to interact with community members. And that means that sometimes we have to collaborate on things that may not necessarily be to the benefit of my company directly, indirectly, absolutely. And so there's that ambassadorship, a community building across the various domains. And I mentioned the expertise. It's critical because people have to see you as experts. It doesn't really matter where you're located, you have to have expertise, or at least perceive that you can help them connect. Sometimes the expertise that we have is being able to reach into those businesses and say, hey, why don't you to connect? I don't have any personal experience there, but I know that you two can connect. And that's valuable experience because we're the dot connectors. What's also very critical is having a true organizational sponsor and understanding at the CXO level. So for us, the CTO absolutely gets it, and actually the general counsel gets it, our objective. So it doesn't really matter where we are located, because at the CXO level, they understand the value of working across these various things, and the CTO absolutely understands that we have to go outside sometimes with the community. The comprehensive scope and the budget is important. We'll come back to this part, which I've mentioned before. It's software plus hardware plus AI plus data plus standards, because again, we're the natural place for it. Metrics and key performance indicators are also very important. How do we measure our people against the business results, right? Just because we say, hey, we're going to work in this community doesn't necessarily guarantee that we either have sponsorship or the budget. How can we tie what we do to the benefit of the organization as a whole, to the company? And that's the same whether it's an OPO or an OSPO or any other organization out there. So broadly, where does openness play? In our opinion, in my opinion, it's everywhere. Right? We've talked about the software. It plays open source proprietary. What if you have an OEM relationship that you then embed in your own product? Hardware, right? Besides the proprietary pieces that we build, like there's RISC-V, there's the Open Compute project. Again, very similar dynamics, community-oriented. Different hardware versus software, absolutely. But communities involve people, it involves objectives, it involves solving problems. Similar, we're seeing things with data, with the Common Voice, ImageNet, the Common Crawl activities that are coming out. Standards been around for a while, but I think what we've seen in the last, say, 10, 15 years is that before developing a standard and then developing the code, it's the other way around, that we're developing the standard through the de facto code, and the de facto standard becomes the code, or the code becomes the de facto standard that then is basically adopted because the code already works and runs. Models, weights are all very similar. Inner sourcing also is very similar, right? So if you don't know the concept of inner sourcing, it's using the open source community practices and project skills in your own corporation behind the firewall. So you kind of act like open source projects, but it's all completely 100% behind. The tools like GitHub are the same. Whether or not you turn it to be public or internal is really a business decision. But the mechanics of collaboration have been proven by the open source community to be the best in breed. So if you leverage those internally, you get the benefit of hiring college grads that have already done that, or people from other businesses. They don't have to learn a new set of techniques. They just hit the ground running and can ultimately contribute quickly to your organization, and they themselves have the same benefits working with other people in your own company that we have working with people external as well. So my I think the opportunity is openness is more than just a philosophy. It is that, but openness is a competitive advantage for those that take advantage of it. And the future of AI, and for the community development everywhere, right? If the more open we are, the quicker we can get to market, the quicker we can develop our people, then we figure out where we can truly differentiate as a business. But we're not recreating the wheel, and we can take advantage of these similar things. And so at the end of in summary, I think the Open Program Office can drive the age of AI, right? OSPOs are already good at ecosystem support. OPOs should be very similar, whether it's open source code, open data, open models, open AI. It doesn't really matter. Pick your open. Openness is a competitive differentiator, and the OPO should be in a great position to take advantage of that position. Driving cross-company alignment across all of these different areas. Now, not all companies are organized where one stop fits all. We ourselves have people that work on standards, work on open source, work across the different groups spread throughout the company. Being centrally located would kind of defeat the purpose and the benefit that we have about being distributed. But the key is that you have enough core competence there to connect the dots, and that you then have consistency across the various teams that can deliver on all the opens. So whether it be open hardware, do you have a consistent way of approaching those projects as you have maybe with open data or open AI? Are you thinking about them similar? Do you have the right people in the room? We have a steering committee with representation from all of these. So the Open Program Office ultimately becomes the de facto center of expertise in community-oriented development. And then this last point around, by implementing all these open methods and technologies within these open ecosystems, the OPO becomes the driver of change. Not only are we influenced by it, but we become the driver of it because we see across the company where things can get better, where we should tweak it, where we should improve it, and ultimately where we can have better return for the company's investment. So with that, we believe open program offices, I think, are the way of the future. We would not recommend creating a new AI office that basically mimics most of the same activities that the OSPO does today. Just leverage your OSPO, extend your OSPO, get buy-in that your OSPO already has that expertise, the processes, the brand awareness, and just augment it with these new activities. And I do believe that the OPO will be a force for driving the next generation of AI. So with that, I'll take questions. Any questions from the group? Yeah. Just ask and I'll repeat it.
Okay. You mentioned metrics and KPIs. Could you give some examples of how you specific metrics and KPIs that you use?
So the question is, what are a good example of metrics and KPIs that we use? So there's kind of two. One is directly with the business, and then there's one kind of on our side of things. So with the business side of things, we track key strategic projects important to the CTO. So the CTO identifies that for this business, here are my key open source projects, and we have internal tooling that actually goes out to GitHub and pulls those stats to say, are we contributing in areas that are strategic to the company? And then we align those to say, hey, and the metric is visible to everybody. So anybody can go to the web page, it's real time, constantly updates every day, and they can say, even for the CEO down, how many contributions is the CEO's organization responsible for, and what are his key top projects? Now, obviously, the CEO doesn't really care about those top projects, but at that level, people on his staff can see, and so it's tried to be baked into the high-level strategy. From the KPIs in our own internal team, it's all around how do we respond to teams when they ask us. So our ticketing system is based on Jira, where we ultimately have compliance-oriented activities, and people come ask us questions. So are we responding quickly? Not that we can actually resolve them quickly, but our KPI is on our response time. Because somebody asking a question may appreciate the fact that it may take some time to go get an answer and come back, but what they want is that a human or some answer comes back relatively quickly while they still have the question on their mind. And so we have KPIs on response time, and we also then track on how long it takes to kind of close that loop end to end. Some of it's us, some of it's them. So there's KPIs there. We also then look at just kind of contributions. Are we doing things in the right areas similar to the business? So does that answer your question? Great, yep. Other questions? Yeah.
I'll say, do you see any differences in a day in the life between the traditional OSPO and the new open office?
So do we see any differences in the traditional day in the life between the historical OSPO and the open program office? So in general, no, because again, we're dealing with very similar things. I think what the differences are, we're maybe meeting with new people. We're certainly having discussions about different technologies, because it's not only about software anymore, but it's very similar around, okay, which communities are we involved in? How do we then go pay attention to seeing some of these community dynamics? What's important to the CTO? What's important to the marketing teams? So the day in the life there is very similar. Like it's the same kind of things, which is why for me, when I flashed that slide up, if you look at the similarities and differences, yeah, there are some differences, but I think there's more similarities than not. And so our typical day in the life is very similar. With now we're doing training on OpenAI, we're doing training on open data. We're going out and gathering expertise on those areas where we're deficient, but having some very rich conversations with the experts in the business. And therefore building up them, building up us. So I think the day-to-day stuff is very similar in terms of the types of things that we're interacting with. I think the content changes slightly. Yeah, great question. Yeah.
I had a question about AIGP certification. Are there people in your organization who pursue this certification coming in? If so, do you find this helpful? If not, why not? I'm just curious about that.
So the question is around AI certification and whether or not we've seen it and if we feel like it's useful. Honestly, I have not seen it. We don't deal with it much, if at all. I don't know if we've seen it at all. So I guess that probably answers the question that I think, and engineers in general, I think as things start out, things are changing so quickly that certification really doesn't buy them much. What they get a lot of feedback from is attending events, attending conversations, getting involved in the communities, and then just the thing that engineers love is just getting their hands dirty. And they can say, hey, I've done this, that, or the other. And we're seeing a lot of people kicking the tires and a lot of people coming to us to say, hey, is this model even approved? How do I approach this? Could it even be approved? It kind of works. Have you seen a better model? So we're getting a lot of the questions around what's the best way to approach the problem? Not so much the certification. Yeah. Yeah, question. Yeah, so the question is, we've talked a little bit about being organizationally, doesn't really matter which organization you're in, but what about the level within that organization? I think in our experience, we've kind of been at various levels of the organization. I think the key part is you have to be around the strategic influencers, whether that strategy is the CTO looking at the technology, whether it's around the CMO looking at the community dynamics around the marketing, whether it's the attorney looking at the IP strategy, or even just at a high enough level where you're dealing with strategies. I think in that regard, we're structured pretty high in the organization so that it doesn't really matter which organization you're in. But I do think that it's still very important that I've been in organizations where the influence can really come from the bottom and the grassroots, as long as those people are influential. And that's critical. You've got to have a CXO team that understands the value that you provide. You don't have to fight over just the existence of your group, because you have to have somebody that can speak at the highest of levels when those conversations are had, not just about budget, but about just priorities and about the influence of community oriented. We've never had an issue with, does our organization have a place in the company? We've all obviously been moved around based on who is in the best position at the time as a manager to understand what we do. And that's because they've also had connections into the community and it made most sense to be there. That's absolutely critical. But I think the other part is being able to then talk to the value of just open source And we've had, when we weren't in other organizations, we've had told them to say, I've got so many things on my plate, it's okay if you're over here. But if you ever hear that you're maybe at risk, tell me, because your role can't go away. Now, we don't have a big team, we're just a handful of people doing a mighty job, but the fact that at the highest levels they understand that open source is absolutely critical to our company's existence, and we've got to have a team. How that team looks like and where that is organized is up for debate, but we don't have to fight the fact that they understand that open source is so critical for our existence. Yeah, good question. Other questions? Yeah.
Have you been able to scale your work or your resources? Because you mentioned all the different open types of offices, and just picking one, we always feel understaffed. So, but you also mentioned having representatives from some of the opens in different departments. Did you find that you had to say that there's a gap missing in one of those areas, and we would like someone else to do it, and we can work with them, but we can't take on that work?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in order to scale, we're a very small team, but we do have representation across the company. And as more and more open activities get added to the plate, how do we then make sure that they're all addressed without being driven crazy? So I think there's kind of two parts to that question. So one is, we recognize as we're dot connectors, as we're out and about the businesses, there's lots of great people that understand open source, that understand open AI, that understand open data in the company already. And it's just, we may not know who they are. So as we discover them or uncover them, now we can connect them to the greater scope and make sure that whatever they're doing matches what the businesses are doing. And in many cases, they're not the same. And just one of the values that we provide is just connecting the dots. And so by connecting the dots, we're adding value already because we can kind of see the whole picture. And those then representatives come and just, they keep doing their day job, but now they have somebody else internally that they can communicate with. And our network grows of experts in the company. That's half of it. The other half is when we don't feel like we really have the right level of expertise and we have to go develop it. We call it the Champions Program. So we basically identify people that are willing, and we have champions kind of 3 different areas, right? There's a compliance set of champions that are all about the licensing and helping with the SBOM creation and that kind of activity. There's the inner sourcing champion that's all about collaboration and wants to make sure that we connect the dots and that we don't duplicate one thing from one BU to the next. And then there's the evolving AI champion. And not one person kind of fits all those 3 bills, but that's something as an open program office we're responsible for. And so we've kind of evolved that over time. And it's also then a thing that is a carrot for them because they can kind of develop expertise in that area and be rewarded for it. And because we're an organization that spans everything, we can kind of get them credit in the right places and the right levels of visibility for helping us do their job, and then the company wins. And then it doesn't take a lot to just say thank you and copy a manager. And that goes a long way. Yeah, good question. Other questions? Okay, hopefully you're all sold on open program offices. I think it is the wave of the future, and I look forward to sitting here in a year and seeing how many people have adopted them. So thank you so much. Have a great evening.